We hope you enjoy this podcast. All our conversations are inspired by films we have selected to appear on sdg.vision. So go and take a look and be inspired by people and organisations who are making valuable contributions to the Sustainable Development Goals and making our world a better place for everybody to live. Now, sit back, enjoy, be inspired, and afterwards, go and take action.
Well, welcome once again to the SDG Vision podcast. And a warm welcome to Rebecca Firth. She's Director of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. Hello, Rebecca.
Hi, Pierre. Nice to be with you today.
Great to have you with us. Thank you so much. And whereabouts are you in the world?
I'm currently based in London in the UK.
Okay, because I read somewhere that you were in Peru.
Yes, I've been very fortunate over the time that I've worked with HOT. I've been able to live in Peru and Colombia and the UK, all kind of supporting the mapping cause. Great,
yeah, wonderful. Well, the good thing about this is it doesn't matter where you are, really. So, but it's just good to have you with us. And we were really interested in the work of your organisation. We found a TED talk that you presented called "Can We Call It a World Map If It Is Missing a Billion People?" which I think is a great title. We got really excited by it, particularly Gary, he's the founder of Gary Battelle, the founder of SDG Vision and a fellow director. And he got really excited by it because he reminded me of a time, it was back 2010, 2011, we were working with an Ethiopian NGO, and we were doing a visit to eastern Ethiopia, to the city of Diradawa. And we were working, or our partner organisation, JECDO, was working with a very marginalised community who were affected by leprosy. And they just weren't on the map, despite their community having been there for about 20, 30 years. There was no sign of them there. And Gary said at the time, he's always ahead of the field, Gary. He said, it's really important. They're mapped, that they map where they are and what there is there and local landmarks, etc. So here we are, about 10 years later, 15 years later, talking to an organisation that does exactly that. So viewers will see the relevance of it all as we go through it, because some people may say, well, maps, so what? Maps are maps. What do they do? They're just there to show you where places are. We'll talk about that. So firstly, perhaps, Rebecca, if you could tell us what Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team is, when it was founded, any sort of interesting background info would be really great.
Yeah, thank you so much for that intro. It's so great to hear that you have a kind of personal connection to this problem. And also interesting that Gary had that thought 15 years ago, because that is when HOT was founded for the first time. So HOT was actually founded by initially some volunteers, but then quite quickly went on to become an NGO. So it's a kind of community of volunteers and also a nonprofit that promotes the creation of open maps, data technologies for humanitarian response and development. That all sounds kind of complicated, potentially a bit jargony. Really what we're trying to do is connect people who have time to people who need to be on the map. We work with volunteers all around the world who contribute their time to make that world map. And then we work with the NGOs, partners, etc., who are delivering services on the ground and don't have the information they need to do that. So if you're missing from the map, you're not just invisible in the map, you're also missing all the key government services that should be provided to you, like water. You're missing being included in things like a public health campaign. You're missing being provided relief in the event of a disaster. So sort of visibility on the map is just such a core part of being able to provide all the things that the kind of international and national system should be providing to you, and something that we've been working to close.
And is it all still volunteers, or is there paid staff? And I know you've got a lot of mappers who are volunteers. But
yeah, so we have about 750,000 volunteers and about 75 staff. So that's a ratio I'm very proud of in terms of, no one in our staff team is, drawing those maps. That's all happening in the community. But yeah, over the last 15 years have really grown and kind of reached more and more people. And, still, I think, very much aware that we're only at the tip of the iceberg. There's a million different ways in which data can be used in every country in the world to improve things for the better. And I think the SDGs make a really meaningful kind of stab at that from a data perspective. You can see, 282 SDG indicators. Those are data points that you need to track to understand that you're making progress on the SDGs. And you need high quality, up-to-date, relevant data for all of them to be able to measure if you're actually having any impact. And so, so excited to be here and talking about this challenge because it's such an important one.
Well, it's lovely that you map your work to the SDGs as well, which I think is really terrific. And we'll come on to that later, I think, in terms of the relevance of the SDGs to the work that you do. Now, you mentioned disaster work, but also access to services. And I can see how, if you're not mapped as a community, if a disaster befalls you, then I can see that, it's going to make it much more difficult for disaster recovery teams coming in to provide the help that's required immediately as fast as possible. But in terms of, you mentioned, sort of services such as hospitals, healthcare, etc. If you're not on the map, then there's a less chance of you getting those services. Could you explain why that would be? Why would it make it easier for a community to get those services than if they weren't on a map?
I think there's two components to that. The first one is visibility. Like it's very difficult to solve a problem that you can't see. And the second one is more about intention. Sometimes groups aren't mapped because they're deliberately not being mapped. Because, say, a government or a local entity doesn't want to acknowledge their existence. So I kind of think of mapping as there's sort of two angles to it. There's productivity. We know that maps help us to do things quicker and better. And then there's power. There's being represented in a data source is a form of justice. It's a way to deliver things. It's a way to acknowledge existence of things in a new way. You don't just have to kind of reinforce past power structures. You can deliberately try to work with communities that have been marginalized, excluded, intentionally not mapped, in order that their needs are centered, are visible, and are kind of considered in work that happens in their area.
Really interesting, that political dimension that communities may be purposefully not be allowed to map or be on the map, which I'd never really thought about before. I think it's really interesting. Have you ever had any sort of issues in terms of either local, regional or national governments preventing you from mapping communities?
I wouldn't say preventing us in the sense that we are always working with the local community to try with the goal that they can map themselves. And I think the local communities have faced a lot of barriers. I think one of the most kind of seminal examples to that was some work that was done quite early on, actually, in HOTS Evolution about 10 years ago, trying to map in Kibera, the largest slum in the world near Nairobi. And the really interesting thing that came about from that project, I think, when you think about mapping, what is mapping, what mapping is needed, is I believe that the mapping was done to kind of show that the slum existed and advocate for better water. But in kind of consultation with the local community, one of the founders of HOT, who ran this project, they ended up wanting to map the cultural elements of their community. They wanted to map the cinemas, the shops, the hairdressers, the churches. And you get this map of Kibera and it shows you kind of all the social things to do, which isn't necessarily what you would think when you say, oh, we need to provide water to a community. But what they wanted to show was that they existed and they lived there permanently. And if you lived there permanently, you have that social fabric of hairdressers and cinemas and things like that. They wanted to demonstrate this is a permanent place, and that's why we need water, not, here's a sort of temporary living situation, and so we can give it a temporary solution. And I think that's a really good example of kind of the power of mapping, of participatory mapping, where it's community-led, because what the community chooses to map might be quite different to what you thought you needed to map based on the problem that you're trying to solve.
It's always the way in development work that the community, if they're allowed to participate, will often reclassify what you're doing and readjust what you're doing, because it's their problems and they know what their problems are and their issues are. And I was really interested. I was reading about your work on your website, and I thought it was a really interesting dimension in terms of gender as well, you know, sort of involving women in mapping. And you talked about participatory mapping. Perhaps you could talk a little bit about that, because I was just looking at it this morning, and I thought that was an interesting, and that really does illustrate, I think, how effective participatory mapping is.
Yeah, I mean, I think one of our sort of fundamental tenets is like the world map needs to be made by the people of the world. So, you know, we need to intentionally include all communities, and I think mapping, and also open source. We're open source, so. You know, mapping open source communities, they don't typically have a kind of much gender diversity. They often are increasing kind of the amount of women and different gender identities that are participating in open mapping has been sort of something we've been working on for a number of years. And it's important to do it intentionally. People map their experience, they map their lived experience, which means if you are not including that group in the map, their considerations won't be discussed. And there's some amazing examples of this. One of the best projects that I ever saw in Peru in terms of that kind of map for productivity versus map for power thing was a group of 3 teenage girls mapping the sexist advertising they saw on their bus to school, just taking photos of these really inappropriate advertisements they were seeing, and then presenting that map to their mayor, saying, this is what I see on the way to school. And then they were invited to write an article for a national newspaper on that experience. And like, to me, that is a really serious power play for 3 15-year-old girls in a rural Peru to be able to do. And I think kind of one of the amazing things about Hot and how Hot's set up, you know, we are a platform which other people can use to map things that they care about, is the things that they care about and the things they map are so much more than you ever imagined. Yeah. You thought, I would have thought, we'll make a data model for public health, we'll make a data model for water and sanitation, we'll make a data model for whatever it is, and we can go out and map that thing. And when you speak to real people who have, real challenges that they want to put on their map, they'll take it in so many different directions. And part of our role, I think, is to facilitate that to happen, to try to make sure that we're serving the needs of the masses with reliable data that can be used for kind of decision-making at a regional or a national level, and also helping individuals, represent challenges they care about and actually do something with that information. And both sides of that are really important.
It's endlessly fascinating, this, because there's different layers, aren't there, of mapping, and that example of the girls mapping the sexist advertising. It's such a powerful tool, really, visual tool to inform decision makers, local politicians, etc., and create change. I think perhaps, and I need to understand this as well, because I don't think I fully understand. How does the mapping work? So do you actively go into a community, your teams, or how do you engage with the communities? How do you identify communities? Do they identify themselves? And what's the technological requirement? It's a big issue, but I think it's important for people to understand how it's done.
Yeah, why don't I talk about the kind of process to make a map, and then we can talk a bit about kind of, how do those specific community projects come up? So to make a map, so first up, you need some imagery. So we have satellite imagery from a bunch of satellite partners. We also have a method and a way in which people can collect drone imagery in a very simple way. So that's your image. Then you do some remote mapping. You take that image and you draw a map on top of it, And this is like, it's a bit like using Microsoft Paint. It's very simple. You get a photo and you sort of draw squiggly lines over the roads. You draw circles or squares over the houses. You tag what you think those things are. We also have some AI tools that can speed that up a bit, make it faster. So then you've got your sort of the outlines of your map. And then you need to color it in, we say. So you need to add that local detail. Is this a house? Is this a shop? Is this a school? What's this road called? Is there a hospital here? So then we have a series of different tools that people can use to add that information locally. So they can contribute that information either sort of individually walking about their day or in a coordinated fashion, get 100 people together to all map this city. And that produces your map. And that map is open source, so it can be used either sort of within the map itself, or you can export that data and use it in other locations, other tools, which is a really critical difference between our work and sort of some other mapping providers as well. In terms of how those ideas come to fruition, so I mentioned at the top we have this kind of massive volunteer community. So those volunteers, some of them work globally, some of them work locally. So you find OpenStreetMap communities in almost every country of the world, whether that's, 1 or 2 people or whether that's 600 people, who kind of contribute to the map in their local area, work on local projects. Those groups are often coming up with ideas, challenges, things they want to map for. We as an organization, we serve, we had, I think in the last 5 years, we've had about 600,000 downloads of our data by humanitarian or development partners. So those are sort of usually kind of formal NGOs, UN institutions, government, who are kind of downloading that data to use. And we've supported about 60 partnerships directly as well. And all the ideas of kind of what are we mapping for, who is doing that, why and where, comes through those partners. There's no one path, and I think it would be a mistake for us to have one path, because the point for us is we want to be as close as possible to a very broad range of actors who can use this data for good, which means we need to go to them. We can't have kind of one approach where they need to come to us. So we deliberately try to sort of embed ourselves in those networks and provide pathways by which those organizations can get in touch, learn to map, develop the mapping they already have, so that they can solve whatever problem it is they're trying to work on. And their problem is never, as I guess I'm sure you understand, their problem is never I don't have a map. The problem is we don't have water, or we don't have access to electricity in these schools or something. And a map is a way to solve that problem, rather than the map in itself being the end goal.
But how does it work in terms of, do you approach the communities? They approach you? Organizations who are doing work in those communities approach you? Is it a mixture of all of them?
Any and all. So obviously we've worked with so many communities in the past 15 years, and a lot of those communities are kind of going on to solve new problems in different ways. Maybe one really good, I could give you one quite specific example. So we're doing some work at the moment in Freetown. The work began wanting to map some informal neighborhoods with the local slum association for slum upgrading. So just looking at upgrading the households. Then, through that project, in came interest from the government around mapping to provide waste removal services for the first time. Then came interest in thermal mapping. How can we better understand heat management in the city? Because we've got a heat problem and we need to be kind of putting in green spaces. Then came questions about disability access. Then came questions about taxation. These are, it started out in one space, and over time it's kind of gathered more ideas, and I hope we'll be able to sort of meet all of those ideas with the mapping that's kind of needed to make them happen. But it's a good example of how you sort of start in one place, but there are so many needs, and mapping is sort of one piece of the puzzle to solve those, and so I'm kind of focusing on how can we get as many pieces of that together as we can.
The fascinating thing about all of this is that the mapping is not an end in itself, that it's used as a tool by communities, and it can be used And there's so many ways in which I suppose that your organisation could be stretched to its very limit in terms of advising. And does that tension exist in terms of, are you very strict at saying, look, we're here for the technological assistance in terms of help you to map your community? But say, for example, a community says, right, we've mapped our community and we can see that, this and this doesn't exist, and that's a political thing, and we need to change this. And I don't know, presumably you don't get involved in that, but does anyone facilitate that?
We do try to help kind of communities use maps as tools of advocacy. But typically the projects we work on, we'd be working with the community and that other partner from the beginning. So we'd be working with the government and the community to have them kind of in dialogue together, creating that data with the knowledge that that's then going to be acted on. There are, of course, examples where that doesn't happen, but to us, having that kind of data user is a really important part. Like, you're not going to have any impact if all you do is make maps. You need to make maps and then get them to be used, so that you actually kind of see the change that you want to. Obviously, I think, it's a bit of an infinite problem. Like, we work in an area home to 1 billion people, and that area is also changing faster than the world that a lot of the listeners of this podcast might live in. If you live somewhere where there's a lot of migration, repeated natural disasters, things like that, then your urban fabric is changing quicker than it is changing if you live somewhere like London, where, you could be living in a house that's been there for 150 years and will probably be there for another 150 years. And so, the tension between sort of how do we fund and how do we resource ourselves to meet that demand is a massive one, and making sure that we are able to kind of grow to meet the demand that's out there. I would describe us still as demand led. I've always thought there was a version of the world in which HOT is almost kind of a for-profit startup that sort of says, the world is unmapped and we're going to start here and end here and map the world. And, that would be great, but you wouldn't have any impact because there's no one who's actually saying, oh, well, I live here and I've got a problem and I need to solve that problem. And we're the other way around. We're sort of demand-based. Where's the problem? How can we fix that? Or how can we help to fix that? And yeah, there's still demand. We haven't reached the stage of having too much supply than demand yet.
Yeah, and I suppose the difference between it being a startup or something is that the communities own their information and their data, etc. So that's the value of that, I think. We started off talking about disasters, and I suppose that people would ordinarily, first of all, think of the use of a map in terms of a disaster. But could you perhaps talk through how community mapping can aid or assist in disaster assistance, or I guess even disaster prevention as well, I imagine. If you could talk to that would be interesting.
So disaster response is a huge part of kind of where we came from. HOT was founded after the 2010 earthquake in Haiti, and it's a massive part of who we are today. Obviously, when a disaster happens, there are major news announcements, everyone's aware of it, and there's two things you can do. You can either donate to a humanitarian organisation or you can map. So we are looking to kind of engage people who want to give time to that disaster. A really good example, I think, is the Turkey-Syria earthquake. This is a good example, I think, because it was one in which maps were used in every stage of the recovery process. So we had a long-standing relationship with Yer Çizenler, which is the local Turkish OpenStreetMap community. They'd existed for several years. We'd worked together before on various refugee projects. And we partnered with them to map building footprints and roads in the most affected areas in Turkey and Syria. And that was used in search and rescue. Right, out the gates, that's the first few days after the disaster. That was used by the Disaster Emergency Management Authority, which obviously are kind of present and coordinating every response. They were using that to coordinate logistics. It was used by doctors to navigate damaged roads and reach affected people in a timely way. and it was used in the setting up of temporary accommodation. So providing electricity in camps, kind of tent cities that are constructed after these types of events. We had a doctor who was using it to track infectious disease spread, which tents had patients affected and how was that spreading, which is really incredible. And then we worked with the Red Cross Climate Centre on climate smart recovery. So understanding, in this area, which buildings have been damaged, of those buildings that have been damaged, which are vulnerable to flooding because they need to be reconstructed in a different way. So this kind of, maps can be used for all sorts of things in a disaster. Sometimes they're just used in one way and not others. But this was a really great example because it kind of shows the role of maps in every stage, from the days to the months after a disaster. You also mentioned kind of planning. Anticipatory action for disasters is a huge, an important thing, and something that we also invest a lot in. Typically, that's things like understanding where the key infrastructure is and what infrastructure would be damaged depending on the size of an event. So, for example, if you somewhere with high flooding, what would a 1 in 50-year flood do? What would 1 in a 100-year flood do, et cetera, et cetera. Understanding those thresholds. Better kind of capacity development with the local disaster management agencies to be able to use data quickly in the event of a disaster. Scenario planning, retrofitting neighborhoods. I mean, this is going to be a huge part of the future. Every city in the world has got their climate action plan, has got the money and the mandate to adapt their cities for a changing climate, which is going to mean hotter and wetter in most places. And what are they going to need to do that? They're going to need maps. They're going to need to understand, well, what does this neighborhood look like now, especially if it's been developed informally? What's the challenge that's going to affect it, and how can I change that? So, things like heat. Okay, I've got an informal settlement where most of the roofs are made of metal. That is going to dramatically increase the indoor temperature of those buildings. If we can paint those roofs white or fit the roof with a different material that isn't going to increase indoor temperature, we are going to make a huge difference to the number of people who are going to be affected by extreme heat. But, what do I need to do that? I need information to be able to plan it, know how much work I've got to do, and actually track that it's happened. So, there's a huge kind of variety of ways, I think, in which maps, data, etc., are going to facilitate change in this kind of moment in time where we have, a few years left in the SDGs, we have a few years left in the climate action plans where, people are still working on the scenario basis. The scenario isn't here, but it will be here. And what we need is data to inform action. And that's what we're trying to produce.
But it's that whole process of getting data to accurately map, how prepared cities are, or, for climate change and blah, blah, blah. It's so interesting because it makes it very real, doesn't it? It makes it, while this will happen tomorrow, well, yeah, but if it does happen tomorrow or in the next 5 years even, you are totally unprepared and your community is totally unprepared. So it seems to me that there's a great educational use for mapping in that context, because often the problem with the climate crisis is that people don't see it immediately. They notice it occasionally. It depends where you are in the world, obviously. But it's not a constant crisis for some people. And so they say, well, we'll worry about that. So shifting the goals, shifting the thresholds. But if you start actively mapping and saying, right, well, we're predicting that the temperature is going to rise by such and such in the next 10 years, and these are the consequences in a city or a community, that's really powerful, because you're basically showing images of the weaknesses and the fragility of coping mechanisms.
Yeah, I think it's, and I would actually go further than that there's a lot of communities where climate change is happening right now. What we have at the moment is global maps, typically produced often by academia, which are very crude. They say sort of, red, amber, green, how is your country going to be affected, right? And you'll see, okay, the whole of Bangladesh is red for flooding, let's say. what that doesn't capture is the lived experience of people who live there right now, who don't have a way to get their experience into that data set. So, you probably know on your road or in your neighborhood which is the area that floods a bit every year. And it might not be a major flood, it might be just a small flood. But like there's one near my house, for example, there's a sort of dip under a bridge that always floods. And there's no way for me to get that information that that's actually happening right now in this neighborhood somewhere. But that will be the place that's most vulnerable as that flood gets worse and worse. And what we want to do really is kind of bridge between these massive global entities who are, I think, working with good intentions, but without access to that boots on the ground information, and kind of connect the two so that we can try to get the information, lived experience of real people in there. But that's hard, right? Like that requires real dialogue. It requires, I think, the sort of bigger players, bigger actors to consider data in a different way. And I've been advocating for this for a very long time with the SDGs, that there is such a massive data gap in measuring the SDGs. I think when they listed the SDGs in 2015, I think only half of them even had any data for them in most countries. What I wanted to talk about is like minimum viable data. So like getting away from this, like everything needs to be to like 5 decimal places, and into like some of the ways we gather data. So when the SDGs were introduced, they came with sort of, 16 SDGs, 282 data points to measure those, and the National Statistical Office of every country who's responsible for that measurement. But what does the National Statistical Office do if they don't actually have data? So not everywhere has a regular census, not everywhere has kind of the regular sort of data gathering kind of opportunities that we might expect. So they've got to engage with more creative forms of data. And sort of we've long been arguing that citizen-generated data is a really important part of solving the SDGs, because it's scalable, it's available, it's quality data. It just doesn't always look like the data that you might be used to seeing. So a really good example of this is a project we did in Tanzania in an area that had been developed informally and had very, very limited drainage, and was experiencing very regular flash flooding. Now, the team went out one day and tried to get historic data. Can you remember how high the flood was last year? Can you remember how high it was 3 years ago? And came back with just crazy data at the end of the day. Sometimes some places sort of this flood was 0.0001 meters, others, the house next door, it was 1.5 meters, really, really hard to compare that data. So they went out the next day and they said, how high was the flood last year? Was it up to your foot? Was it up to your ankle? Was it up to your knee? Was it up to your waist? And my waist is probably in a different position to yours. My foot is probably a different height to yours, but there's a big difference between a waist and a foot. And I would call that minimum viable data. That's data that you can actually use to take a decision, to do an action. And this extends in so many different use cases, so many different areas. There was another one in Liberia. It was a coastal area affected by increasing storm surges from the sea. And the local community mapped the depth of foundations of houses by how many fingers deep they were, 1, 2, 3, 4 fingers, because that will be a good indicator of it. Is that house going to flood? And again, 4 fingers to 1 finger, our fingers aren't the same size, but there's a big difference between 4 and 1. And that can help you understand, how do I direct my resources? So a lot of what we're arguing for is, it doesn't always happen with body parts, but, how do we look at the problem, not from what's the perfect data? What tool do I need to measure? How many decimal places do I need? And look actually at what is the basic information I need to solve this problem? And if you start there, then you can very quickly get a lot of information, which is really important. There is a massive data challenge with the SDGs, and that data is important for 2 things. It's important for achieving the SDGs. What information do we need to actually execute well on these, and for measurement. How do we actually track, measure over time that we are making progress? There is a huge lack of data in most communities, most countries, with regard to the SDGs. I mean, there are all sorts of dashboards and organizations out there that actually track this and their progress. You know, the core kind of take-home message is that there is not enough data out there, which means we need to engage with alternative, more innovative data sources. And there's lots of those out there. There's, you know, mobile phone data, there's consumption data from companies. But one really critical thing, I think, is citizen-generated data, which is kind of engaging with people and communities to provide data about where they live, which can be done in a scalable and very cheap way. But typically what's required when you do that is to think about data in a different way. So, you know, take off your head statistician. Gosh, that's hard to say. Take off your head statistician hat, where you're thinking about kind of, you know, the art of data and kind of incredibly kind of complicated and thoughtful ways of gathering data, and put on the hat of kind of, what is the information I need to have to solve this problem? And that will be a very, very different type of data. It's usually much more general, much more easily gathered. And critically for us, you know, it doesn't require, you know, imported equipment. It doesn't require kind of extensive knowledge to be able to do. You don't need to necessarily be able to read or write or use a ruler or things like that in order to be able to provide basic data. And so, yeah, we find that really critical to solving the data gap in the SDGs is finding ways to connect with data sources that might not look like the ones you're used to, but that are really valuable and critically available at a mass scale. Because let's remember, we've got 16 SDGs and the whole world. So these are things we need to be able to measure at scale.
So, I mean, how does it relate to the SDGs? For people who are not really very au fait with the SDGs, Can you explain how your mapping or that work then relates to the indicators? Because I suppose a lot of people aren't aware, nor should they necessarily be, that there are a massive indicators against each SDG. Could you explain a little bit more about that?
I would love to. I once spent a very long afternoon individually counting each SDG indicator to figure out how many of them are geospatial. So you've got 16 SDGs and you've got about 282 indicators to measure those. I'm going to give you an example of one. SDG 9.1.1, percentage of population that live within 2 kilometers of a year-round road. What do you need to measure that? You need to know, where are all my year-round roads and where are people living? That's it. When you actually look at the SDGs in their full sense, and this is a generous take, but about 86% of them, I think, need maps. So this is everything from where's my year-round road to percentage of people with access to a library, proportion of population with access to clean water, proportion of population that live within a certain distance of a school. But they go further and further. There are things in there like perceptions of safety in public space. Where are my public spaces? Who is using them? And how safe do they feel? It's actually really difficult to gather that kind of information if you don't have some kind of map or geographic way of gathering them. They're really, really complicated. Often these indicators, you might be putting multiple different types of data into measuring just one of them. But kind of the critical point I see is 86% of them have a geographic element, which makes sense, right? We're trying to help people. People live in specific places and we need to help them in ways that are targeted to those places and to who they are. And because of that, we need a vast amount of geographical data to know that we're making true progress. And yeah, it's a very, very interesting challenge. I will say it definitely was a slightly dry afternoon reading every single indicator one by one. But I think really important to show, the power of maps in this context.
I'm glad you did spend the afternoon reading that, because I think it was a really good practical illustration of the relationship between maps and mapping to the SDGs, which, I certainly haven't thought about before. I'm sure there are people who have. But who are you talking to? Are you talking to the UN about this, or are you talking to? Or do they talk to you about it? Or is there any conversation?
Yeah, well, we're lucky that we've had a huge amount of support from groups within the World Bank as we've kind of innovated our technology and our process. There are some really strong advocates there, which is important. Those tend to be kind of project-specific, government-specific, interventions in particular areas. At a kind of more meta level, there's a group called the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, which perhaps gets the award for having a slightly more complicated name than HOT, GPSDD. But that's a kind of an entire partnership that's set up just for the purpose of sustainable development data. Which really puts in context, okay, well, if that's enough of a thing that we need a whole organization to think about it, this is a massive challenge. And they have hundreds and hundreds of partners all over the world, both organizations like mine, kind of data creators, but also they work with national statistical offices. So that's the governments responsible for measuring the SDG. And they do some amazing things. They put us together. They put people like me who work with hackers all over the world to figure out how you can make minimum viable data in your maps. And then they kind of connect us with organizations like the Kenya National Bureau of Statistics, one of the most innovative national statistical agencies in the world, and figure out how we work together. And they've done a huge amount to sort of advance this cause of citizen-generated data and sort of seeing that as a valid, valuable, important data source to take us forward. And I think work like that is absolutely vital because there's you need the doers, but you also need the policy people, the advocators, the campaigners to make sure that this is seen on a global stage, with the likes of UNGA and Davos and all these kind of global events that people hop to, so that, this is actually something that can be considered at the scale that it needs to be.
It's great. It's refreshing to hear that, to be honest with you, that there is some joined up, not just thinking, but action as well. And, it's SDG 17 partnership for the goals, it's about partnership. Mm-hmm. And that's really good to hear. Now, in your TED talk, you mentioned that I think at that stage, which I think was 2020 about then, wasn't it?
Yes, mid-pandemic.
Yeah, that's a good marker, isn't it? We kind of measure things in terms of the pandemic now, don't we? Relationship to the pandemic. I think you said that you had 750. Well, you said you've got 750,000 mappers now. I think you were looking to get to 1 million at that point. So you've huge stride towards that. So where are these mappers? Are they always in the communities, or are there people who are working outside of those communities helping to map as well?
So earlier when I talked about that mapping process, the first one being kind of drawing maps over satellite or drone image, that can be done by anyone, anywhere. And all sorts of people contribute to that for all types of reasons. From, we have volunteers who maybe have retired and are kind of interested in, traveling the world through their computer and mapping new places. We have people who are at the other end of the spectrum. They've got to do some volunteering for their scouts group or something like that. We have individuals who are interested in mapping for all sorts of purposes. And then we have the kind of local mappers. So that's people who live in the place that they are mapping. Sometimes they do that remote mapping because, maybe it's a complicated neighborhood. They know that neighborhood very sort of better than others. They know what the sort of buildings look like, etc. This is really important in places like an informal neighborhood, like a slum, where, buildings are incredibly close together. One roof might be made out of multiple materials. It's not so easy for someone who doesn't live there to actually identify, where does one building end and another begin. So that sort of really complicated mapping is always better done locally. But that local data, that can't be done without somebody who's actually kind of in that community and gathering information about the place that they live.
And are you still looking for mappers? And if so,
always.
And if so, how can they contact you and get involved?
Always. We have a bunch of information on our website, which is hotosm.org, where people can learn to map and get involved in mapping. One of the things you can always do, I think, to get your eye in is to go to OpenStreetMap and open up the place you live and just see what's in there. Typically in high income countries, the map of OpenStreetMap is pretty good. In my neighborhood, for example, someone's mapped all the garden fences, all the bins in the public park. That is a lot of detail. But you can see sort of what's there or what could I add. Just add one thing that you see in your neighborhood. Then from there, kind of building to mapping other places you don't live. That happens through our mapping tools, which you can find out about on the website. And we also have a number of other ways that people volunteer. They volunteer to lead our disaster activation responses. They volunteer in our community engagement activities. They join webinars, trainings on how to do more complicated type of mappers, like becoming a validator. After the map happens, somebody who's really, really good at mapping comes and checks out the mapping you've done and gives you some feedback, helps you to get better, validates that data is accurate. We're always looking for more of those. Would absolutely love to see more and more people getting involved. This is a movement of people who are trying to create data for change and trying to support the world as it goes to kind of achieve the SDGs. And it's not achieved by me or any individual in the organization. It's achieved by the power of that group coming together and contributing their time. All we can do is kind of keep trying to turn that wheel, stoke it, and grow it bigger and bigger.
Yeah, so an entry point for a person who has not mapped or doesn't have any particular technical skill, it's doable. They can join at some level and make a difference in terms of mapping.
Yes, yeah. Doing the remote mapping, all you need is a laptop and internet connection and the ability to draw a square. In person, we've worked really hard on making the mapping tools available at a kind of lower and lower technical level. It used to be when I started doing this in 2014, it used to be that, you needed to send GPS units all over the world. And if we did a mapping project, we also needed to provide phones or tablets. But now sort of basic smartphone availability is so high that we don't need to provide equipment anymore because people have their own equipment. One of our taglines for our work is local people, local knowledge. Local people, local devices, open knowledge. So you want a local person working with some equipment they already own to create open knowledge. And I think whenever you mess up parts of that is where you see unsustainable development. It's where you see sort of teams flown in from outside or fancy equipment. Someone sent a fancy drone, but then someone flew it into a building and we had to send it back to America to get fixed. And it took 7 months to get it back through customs. Like, this is very, very real kind of practical things that happen to people who are running development projects. And if you don't have local people, local devices and open knowledge, you're going to run into hiccups like that kind of time after time, and all your projects aren't going to have the impact that you want them to.
Absolutely, and it's totally disempowering, isn't it, as well? So I think there's
I mean, if you want local capacity, it's got to be something that stops. We're always talking about what's the non-hot version of this.
Yeah.
So if hot folded tomorrow, what still exists? Yeah. And that's so important to ask yourself constantly, because you can't be secure of your funding, you can't be secure of the climate that you. I mean, don't look out the window right now. The climate is not good out there, is it? No. You've got to make sure that, if your organization doesn't sustain, this work can. And that's absolutely critical to good design.
Such a responsible thing. It's such a responsible act to take, to ensure that this approach can outlive the organization. As you say, funding situations are pretty difficult at the best of times. One of the other things that I suppose finally, the thing we're here to promote the Sustainable Development Goals, and it's become clearer and clearer to me how important the SDGs as a framework is to your organisation. And you're probably the first organisation that really, it seems that you've taken them not as a sort of an add-on and perhaps we should refer to the SDGs, because it's good to be seen to be doing that. But it seems that you've talked about indicators, etc. Why do you think the SDGs is important to the work of Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team?
It's a great question, and you're right. I've spent a lot of time aligning our work to the SDGs, and I've done that, I think, on purpose because they're a complicated framework. They represent the nuance, complexity, and difficulty that is needed to really do development work well. So I often think about the Millennium Development Goals, the precursor to the SDGs, as they kind of picked all the low-hanging fruit. They were quite simple, and they sort of took, for example, one of the big ones there was people living on under $1 a day versus over $1 a day, right? And it's important work, but it's not that hard to move someone from living from sort of 0.99 to 1.1. So all the low-hanging fruit was picked there. Then in 2015, it was, okay, right, we've got the easy fruit, now we've got to get the hard fruit. It turns out that's really complicated. It's really difficult to move someone from living on $0.2 a day to 1.1. It is really difficult in the context that we've had since they were introduced. We've had COVID, we've got the US funding crises, we've had conflict all over the world in ever increasingly sort of horrific and ways that you didn't think you could imagine. And kind of in this culture of converging crises, I think the SDGs give us a framework where we can talk about what does meaningful sustainable development look like. And it's so important that I think we don't overcomplicate it from where it is. I think actually they represent a lot of nuance, but we can also see that we don't have the information right now to know how well we're doing on them. And I think a lot of them we've actually not just struggled to measure, we've actually slipped down on because of things like COVID that have had a negative impact on a lot of things, especially health and education. And so I think it's important we sort of stick with them and we continue to use that as a framework so that we're all speaking the same language and can make sure that we're solving problems in a way that's thoughtful. I think I'm a little bit worried that the next version of the SDGs, sort of once we get to 2030 and make whatever's next, that we might go back to the very simple way. All content is getting shorter form, everything's getting shorter, everyone's attention span is shorter. And I think that would be a huge mistake because the hardest work is yet to do. And so let's not dumb it down. Let's actually see it for what it is. Acknowledge that, in a lot of contexts, the SDGs, you're working in the hardest context of the world. You're working in a kind of intersection of government failure, market failure of everybody to actually solve that problem up until now. That is hard work and it needs to be respected. And, this isn't charity. This isn't something that should be dumbed down. This is incredibly difficult professional labor and it needs to be considered as such. And I really hope that the next version of the SDGs, or as we kind of come up on the SDG sort of end period, that's something that's really sort of heavily discussed.
You're a great ambassador for the relevance of the SDGs. It's just it's so exciting to hear that, because, you think maps, how do they relate to the SDGs? You've concretely discussed how they relate and how important they are to be able to refer to them. And because they're all interrelated, poverty is not, as you said, poverty is not simple. Now, it's not just about somebody getting more money. The money that they're earning could be damaging the environment, could be with a company that's damaging the environment, so climate action and meaningful work, gender equality, etc. They all fit together. If development is going to be done properly and inclusively, meaningfully, then it's important to think in that sort of, dare I say it, holistic way. That it is complicated, but at the end of the day, you spent an afternoon and a half looking at all the indicators. Well, people don't necessarily have to look at those. It's good to look at the visual representation of the 17 goals and be aware of how they work together, how they can work together in any place, in any community, in any setting. So it's been fascinating, Rebecca. I really thank you for talking through it. And making me understand and the audience understand how important mapping and data is to development and the future of our world, really, in the grandest respect. We hope you'll come back on again, perhaps at that 5-year mark when the SDGs have ended. And as you quite rightly say, it's important not to dumb them down, but actually learn from what we've learned in this 15-year period and make them more effective even than they are now, more relevant. So thank you very much. I know you're very busy, but thank you for spending the time. It's been fascinating. We'll put a link to your website. We'll also put your TED Talk, which was terrific, at the end of this podcast interview as well, so people can have a look at it. And really do encourage people to get involved with your work. Thank you, Rebecca.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Pierre. And if you want to be a mapper, you know where to find us, hotosm.org. Thank you.
I might start mapping. Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Are you a designer, content creator, programmer, an open source enthusiast, or maybe just a newbie who wants to explore the world of open source? Whatever your skills might be, then watch this video to the end to see step by step how you can contribute to hot OSM open source projects with confidence as a complete beginner. Before we dive deep into the steps, firstly, let me tell you about the Humanitarian OpenStreetMap Team. Hot OSM is a tech and innovation group dedicated to using open source mapping to support disaster response, humanitarian aid, and development projects worldwide. As a beginner who knows completely nothing about geospatial data and OpenStreetMap mapping, I was eager to make an impact in the humanitarian response to communities in disaster and crisis. I may not be part of a rescue team, but I know I can do something through open source contributions. Hot OSM gave me the right directions, I felt involved, and I was making impactful contributions in less than 48 hours. So why should you contribute to Hot OSM project? There are so many compelling reasons that can benefit you directly, like skill development, portfolio enhancement, etc. But we believe humanitarian impact is a good reason to contribute. Your contributions directly support humanitarian efforts worldwide, helping to save lives and improve the well-being of communities that are affected by disasters and crises. Here's how you can contribute to Hot OSM projects in 3 easy steps. 1. Find a task. 2. Contribute. And then number 3, submit your contribution. Beware that you can contribute to both code and no-code projects, but for this example, I will show you how to contribute to open map data by mapping areas of crisis. Step 1, find a task. Head over to hotosm.org, click Start Mapping, and then sign up to create an account. Enter your name and email address, and click Next. Click again to create an OSM account. Enter your details, create a password, and then click Sign Up. Then select your location, read and check the terms and conditions, and then click on Continue. Once you've verified your email, click on the link provided to your email and log in to pick a project. Step 2. Contribute. Here you can see the different projects to contribute to, the urgency level and the task level. Let's click on the easy task to begin with. Click on the red Contribute button to start mapping. Then click on Map a Task. For this example, we will be mapping buildings. Buildings will usually look like this from an aerial view. You can use the plus and minus button to zoom in and zoom out. Once you've identified a building, click on the area tool to start mapping. You map by creating points around the building. Click, move to the next corner, and click. Continue to use around the building and press the Enter key on your keyboard. Then right-click on your selection to square the map, and click on Square. Or press a shortcut Q on your keyboard to square your map. Next, you need to select a feature type, and in this case, that is a building. You may go ahead and map more buildings, and don't forget to square your markings. Once you're done, click Save. Then go left and click Upload to upload your saved map. Quick tip: it's not necessary to check this box that says I would like someone to review my edits, because your work will be checked through the Tasking Manager validation process. So go on and click Upload. Step 3. Submit. Finally, you need to submit your task. If you're a developer or conversant with GitHub jargons, this is actually more like directly committing to GitHub, because now your saved edits go straight to OSM. This should only be considered after saving and if you need to stop mapping. Otherwise, keep mapping. On your right, you have options yes and no. Select yes if you think the task is completely mapped, or select no if there are still more tasks to be mapped. In this case, we can see that there are more buildings to map, so I'll choose no. And lastly, click on Submit Task. There you have it, the 3 easy steps to contributing to the Hot OSM open source project.
I hope this was fun for you as it was for me, and if you have any question, please leave a comment and we'll respond to you shortly.
If you're interested in contributing to more advanced or code projects, please check out our pinned repositories on GitHub with the link below. So whether you are passionate about mapping, humanity, coding, documentation, content, or collaboration, Hot OSM offers a welcoming and inclusive environment where your contributions can help save lives and make the world a better place.
Join us in harnessing the power of open source for humanitarian causes. Let's save lives together.